Last week in Lent 2, we read from John chapter 3 and heard the reveal to Nicodemus that Jesus has come to earth not to condemn but to save. And not only save the Jewish people, but save all humanity, and in fact the entire cosmos. The third chapter of John's Gospel ends with Jesus baptizing and preaching in the Judean countryside. Chapter 4 begins with Jesus finishing up in Judea and returning home to Galilee. Verse 4 says, "But he had to go to Samaria." We didn't read that in our lectionary reading today, but I think it provides the narrative link to what just went on. Jesus speaking about saving and not condemning the world. So by going to Samaria, he is showing the disciples what he means by the world. By the first century of the Common Era, Samaritans held a Torah-centered faith focused on the patriarchs, centered on Mount Gerizim, and looked for a Messiah who would be a prophet like Moses. While the Jewish people held a broader scriptural tradition that included the prophets, centered on worship in Jerusalem, and looked for a Messiah king in the line of David. Although sharing the same founding history, they currently shared nothing else, including food, drink, or relationships. Well, they shared one thing: a hatred and animosity towards each other. Most Jews would walk around Samaria rather than set foot inside it. This interaction between Jesus and the woman is in stark contrast to the interaction between Nicodemus that we read about last week. Among those contrasts, Nicodemus comes as a person in authority, as a man, as a Pharisee. He plays the role of an insider, a person accustomed to being included in the loop, and included as one who represents the community's best judgment. By comparison, the woman comes to Jesus without even a name. Instead, her identity is obscured by markers of her exclusion. As a Samaritan woman, she lives her daily life in the shadow of her own marginality. Unlike Nicodemus, who sneaks in through the streets of Jerusalem under the cover of night, Jesus initiates the dialogue with the Samaritan woman in broad daylight, raising eyebrows immediately. The narrative picks up with Jesus at a well, asking the Samaritan woman for a drink, and she is surprised by this. She is probably surprised to find anyone else there, because going to draw water in the heat of the day is a strange choice. It makes much more sense to go in the morning while it is still cool. We don't know why the woman picks this time, but I think it's likely because she wanted to go to the well in silence, in privacy, avoiding others. Who she might run into. And I think she's surprised when she finds Jesus there asking her for her drink. And she responds to Jesus' question of, "Will you give me a drink?" by acknowledging the two barriers that Jesus has smashed in his asking for the drink, both the barrier of gender and the barrier of ethnicity. She is curious what's going on here, and will go back and forth with Jesus in this discussion. And in this discussion of back and forth, Jesus will begin to reveal to her who she is. Jacob Neuser, in his book A Rabbi Talks with Jesus, explains that for a rabbi to argue and dialogue with others was a sign of respect. And I quote, "It is my form of respect, the only compliment I crave from others, the only serious tribute I pay to the people I take seriously." In this discussion that Jesus has with the woman, he is bringing honor to her, elevating her beyond the glass ceilings that gender and ethnicity creates. And the story quickly turns when she asks for the living water that Jesus offers. "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty." In response, Jesus says, "Go call your husband and come back." And as we read, she tells him she has no husband, which is likely the response she would have given to hide her current reality from people. But Jesus knows this woman and articulates her full situation. Jesus says, "You are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband." One can almost hear the thud of her response. She is likely feeling defeated, ashamed. Now she looks at Jesus and studies him, listens to him, And we have to think that Jesus does not say, go and sin no more, as he does with the woman who is accused of adultery. Instead, Jesus speaks to her of worship in spirit and in truth, not worship confined to an exclusionary zone based on gender, ethnicity, or even geography or conventional morality, but worship that will include even her. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. The woman was surely fearful that her marital reality would be the thing that would finally exclude her from what this compelling man, this man Jesus, is speaking to her about. But it doesn't. Her reality and her shame is brought into the noonday light, and Jesus doesn't flinch. Even more than that, he reveals himself to her. So why does Jesus ask about the 5 husbands? To shame her? To make sure she knows how lowly she is? Or perhaps, and this is my thought, to reveal who he is? Jesus names her truth and then shares his truth. This is a sharing, a mutual sharing of revelation, of truth. They stand before each other exposed. You know who I am, and I know who you are. In this moment at the well, it's an amazing moment of intimacy between 2 people. And she now knows that Jesus is someone special. Initially, she thinks he's a prophet and shares her hope to Jesus for the arrival of the Messiah. And Jesus does something amazing in this moment. He says, I am he. This is the first announcement by Jesus of his identity as Messiah. He didn't choose the disciples to reveal this to, the leaders, the powerful, but he chooses the most marginalized person, a Samaritan woman who's been married 5 times and is living with a 6th partner. He says to her, I know you, and I want you to know me. And like the Samaritan, don't we hesitate in being known? We each have things that we keep hidden, and we think we can keep them hidden from God. But this passage teaches us that God knows and does not flinch. Jesus knows the woman is in a terrible situation. He knows her shame, and he doesn't point her situation out to shame, but rather to reveal who she is, to give her the living water that she craves. Jesus elevates her status and communicates that I see you fully as you are and love you. And this is what God says to each of us. I see you as you really are and love you. In the words from last week that we read in John 3, Jesus doesn't come to condemn, but comes to save. And how would being known heal and empower us? To be known by God is one thing, but to be known by God and to exist in a community that knows you, I would suggest is even more powerful. Imagine a community of people who knows you and accepts you still. Not only that, but loves you and rejoices when you arrive and doesn't flinch when you stumble, but works to pick you up. This is an idealized sort of family, certainly not the family that many people have, but this is the family, the community that God calls his church to be, that a place where we would be known and received, first received and known by God, but then received and known by others. But we rightly hesitate in being known because we've been hurt and we've been disappointed by others, and finding a way to trust is not always clear. But I think there is a way, and I think it is rooted in how we respond to the fact that God knows us and accepts each of us. Did you notice the response to Jesus that the woman has? The disciples arrive back and their conversation ends. Surely she notices the faces of 12 men who show up with dinner. And I wonder, when I was reflecting on this passage this week, if Jesus gives them a stern glance not to say anything. You know, that silencing glance that a mother might give a child. Because this is a group of people, the disciples, who often say and do the wrong thing. So biting their tongues in this moment of curiosity, at the very least, seems out of character. But they do. They withhold their critique and thoughts and let the woman go on her way. I think they're also is something possible that they recognize that something amazing was going on in their midst. So the woman leaves, and leaves in such a rush that she forgets her water jar and races back to the city. Jesus has not at this stage forgotten about his hunger and thirst. He would be very hungry and thirsty because he still has not had anything to eat or drink. And the disciples bring him food, yet Jesus does not eat. And this really struck me. Why does Jesus not just sit down and eat and then get on with teaching the disciples, his conversation with the disciples? And I think it's because of the woman's response. Her enthusiasm, the urgency with which she leaves the well,